Chapter 6 Radio Mullah. I was at the home of one of my relatives in Mingora one evening when I heard a strange sobbing coming from the radio. After a long day of cooking, the women had gathered around the radio as they cleaned up. As usual, I was doing my best to get out of having to do the dishes, but I stopped at the sound of this odd weeping. At first, it sounded like just another imam giving advice about how to live a virtuous life. Quit smoking, he told the men, and pray daily. The women murmured in approval, my mother among them. Then he began to cry. Stop listening to music, he begged. Stop going to movies. Stop dancing. Stop, he begged, or God will send another earthquake to punish us all. Some of the women began to cry. Terrifying memories of the earthquake the previous year were fresh in their minds. Some of them had buried children and husbands and were still grieving. I knew what this radio mullah was saying wasn't true. An earthquake is a geological event that can be explained by science, I wanted to tell them. But these women, many of whom had no education and who were brought up to follow the dictates of their religious leaders, were frightened. As the mullah wept, so did they. Even at school, all that my friends could talk about was the radio mullah. Although my father told us not to listen, our old radio was broken, so I hadn't heard his latest broadcasts. But I heard them at friends' and relatives' houses, and my friends at school repeated his nightly sermons almost word for word. All music was haram, he said, forbidden by Islam. Only his radio station was permitted. Men should grow their hair and beards long, not keep them short, in what he called the innovative fashion. And women, he said, should stay at home in purdah quarters at all times. They should go out only in emergencies and only wear a burqa, and only with a male relative. At first, my mother had enjoyed his sermons when she listened to them with our relatives, especially when he spoke about the need for daily prayer. People, especially women, romanticized him. People thought he was a good interpreter of the Holy Quran and admired his charisma. They liked his talk of bringing back Islamic law because everyone was frustrated with the slow, corrupt Pakistani justice system. His followers chanted poems that sounded beautiful but were in fact messages to motivate girls to stop going to school. My father disapproved of him from the beginning. No radio mullah is going to tell me what to do. This mullah, he declared, is nonsense and trouble. Don't speak that way, my mother told him. God will be angry with you. My father turned out to be right. He had done some investigating of the man behind the mysterious radio voice. This mullah is a high school dropout. He doesn't even have religious credentials. This so-called mullah is spreading ignorance. The voice on the radio belonged to Maulana Fazullah, one of the leaders of the TNSM. His followers had helped so many people after the earthquake, but he was taking advantage of the trauma to instill fear in them too. Soon Fazlullah's attacks became personal. He announced the names of men who'd spoken out against him. People we knew, people we didn't, people who were campaigning for peace in the valley, but also people who thought they were having private conversations. They were all suddenly, publicly called sinful. It was as if the radio mullah and his men could see through walls. Now that I was getting older, it wasn't so easy to sit in on the men's discussions without being noticed, so I would offer to serve them tea, if only so I could hear what matters they were discussing. In those days, there were only two topics of conversation, the radio mullah and the fighting just across the border in Afghanistan. I was 4 years old when the 9/11 attacks took place, but I'd grown up hearing the name Osama bin Laden. In our country, everyone knows about 9/11 and Osama bin Laden. It was said that he'd planned those attacks not far away in Afghanistan, and for the past several years, the United States and its allies have been fighting a war to find him, and to defeat al-Qaeda and the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which was protecting him. The Taliban. As soon as I would hear that word, my ears would perk up. I'd think back to the conversation I'd had with my father when we were in Shangla. The Taliban seemed like something far away then, something bad in a distant place. Many of my father's friends believed that despite how popular Fazlullah was becoming and his association With the Taliban in Pakistan, they were still too far away to be a concern. But he warned them that there would come a day when the Taliban would reach our valley. They are already in the tribal belt, he said, and they are coming nearer. Then he quoted a proverb, "Coming events cast their shadows before." Fazlullah moved slowly at first, but in the 2 years that followed the earthquake, he cast a long shadow indeed. I was growing up, and for the first time it occurred to me that our world was changing before my eyes, and not for the better. When I went to bed each night, I had a talk with God. "Please, God, tell me what I can do. I'm a small girl, but maybe you have a small job for me." I woke up one day with a plan. I would ignore all this Fazlullah gossip when I got to school. My friends and I should be talking about Bella and Edward, or Fruity from the Indian TV show San Pari. If those topics were off limits for the time being, we could talk about cricket, or annoying little brothers, or 100 other things. But when I arrived at school, my friends were all huddled in the corner talking about the latest sermon. The night before, Fazlullah had announced that schools for girls were haram. This man had just declared our peaceful sanctuary forbidden by the Holy Quran. He was only a voice on the radio then. What we didn't know was that he would go much further in his campaign against girls' schools in the days ahead. Chapter 7. The Taliban in Swat. The radio mullah continued his campaign against anything he deemed un-Islamic and Western. People listened to his broadcasts regularly, many to hear him announce names and make sure theirs weren't on the list. Through his illegal radio broadcasts, he encouraged parents to refuse polio vaccinations for their children. He claimed that this medical aid was not meant to help. He said it was a ploy by Western countries to harm Muslim children. But he wasn't just interfering with health care and speaking out against girls' schools. He was also threatening barbers who offered so-called Western haircuts and destroying music stores. He persuaded people to donate their jewelry and money, and he used the funds to make bombs and train militants. We had seen Fazlullah's followers with their long hair and beards dressed in black turbans and white shalwar kameez in the small towns on the way to visit our family in the mountains. His men carried guns and walked menacingly through the streets. But even though we had not seen his men in Mingora proper, we felt his presence. It was as if he spoke from the heavens, casting a dark cloud of fear over our valley. The police tried to stop him, but his movement was only getting stronger. In May 2007, he signed a peace agreement with the government saying that he would stop his campaign against polio vaccinations and girls' education, as well as his attacks against government property, and the government would allow him to continue his broadcasts. In July, everything changed. Around the time of my 10th birthday, the Pakistani army led a siege of a women's madrasa in Islamabad, our nation's capital. A group of militants that had been taking an active stance against the government had now taken hostages and hidden inside the madrasa of La Masjid, or the Red Mosque. After the army's attack, which lasted for days and ended in many deaths, Fazlullah made one of his strangest announcements. He declared war on the government and called for people to rise up in violence. The peace treaty he had signed became nothing more than a memory. But the government ignored him like an annoying fly. And it ignored us, too, the people in Swat who were under his thumb. We were angry with our government and angry with these terrorists for trying to ruin our way of life. But my father said our family should do its best to ignore them as well. We must live a full life, if only in our hearts, he said. And so, as usual, our family dinner conversations were about things of the mind, Einstein and Newton, the poets and the philosophers, and as usual, my brothers and I fought over the remote, over who got the best grades, over anything and everything. Somehow I could ignore the Taliban, but I could not ignore these two annoying characters. Fighting with your brothers, I told my father, is also a part of a full life. Soon Fazlullah joined forces with Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, or the Pakistan Taliban, and announced that women were banned from public places. The males in the family should enforce this order, he said, and keep tight control over their families or be punished themselves. Within 6 months, the streets became strangely absent of women because they were afraid to go out to do their shopping. The DVD shops that sold Bollywood films and children's movies pulled down their shutters and went out of business. Fazula claimed that watching movies and TV shows was a sin because it meant that women would look upon men and men would look upon women who were forbidden to them. Under the threat of his followers, people were terrified. Some took their TVs, DVDs, and CDs to the public square where the Radio Mullah's men set them on fire. Stories spread that his men were patrolling the streets in pickup trucks, shouting his orders from megaphones. Then we heard that his followers were listening at people's doors. If they heard a TV, they bashed the door in and then smashed the TV to bits. After school, my brothers and I cowered in front of our beloved TV, the volume turned down to a whisper. We adored our shows and didn't understand how wrestlers with funny names and a little boy with a magic pencil were so bad. But every time there was a knock on the door, we jumped. When our father came home one night, I asked him, "Abba, will we have to burn our TV as well?" Eventually, we moved our TV to a closet. At least, if strangers came to the door, they wouldn't see it. How had this happened? How did an unschooled fanatic turn himself into a kind of radio god? And why was no one prepared to defy him? Through it all, the Kashal school carried on as usual. A few more of our classmates dropped out, but the rest of us appreciated our schooling all the more. Our class even had a discussion. The government may not be behaving as it should, but we could run our classroom a bit more like a democracy. We hit on an idea. Since the most studious girls always sat up front, we would switch seats every week. If you got to the front row one week, you'd find yourself in the back the next. It was a bit of a game, but it was our small way of saying that all girls and all people are equal. But beyond the walls of our school, Mingora had become like a prison. Banners that read "Women Not Allowed" were strung up at the entrance to the market. All music and electronic shops were shut down. Fazula even outlawed an old-fashioned children's game called Karam, where we flicked discs across a wooden board. He had started announcing the names of schoolgirls on his radio show. "Miss So-and-so has stopped going to school and will go to heaven," he said. Or "Miss So-and-so has left school, and I congratulate her parents." My mother now insisted that I never walk to school by myself, for fear that I would be seen alone in my school uniform by the Taliban. Every day I noticed that a few more of our classmates were missing, and every night on his radio show, Fazula kept up his attacks, saying that girls who went to school were not good Muslims, that we would go to hell. One day, one of our teachers went to my father and said he would no longer teach girls. Another said he was leaving to help Fazula build a religious center. It was a dark day. The Kashal school, which had always been our refuge, had fallen under the shadow of the Radio Mullah. Fazula had set up a public court to enforce his edicts, and his men were now flogging or killing policemen, government officials, and other men and women who disobeyed him. Hundreds gathered to watch the floggings, shouting, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," with each lash. Sometimes people said Fazula arrived at the proceedings galloping in on a black horse. Much of Fazula's justice was exacted in the dead of night. Later, in his reign of terror, violators were dragged from their homes and killed. Their bodies would be displayed in the green square the next morning. Often a note was pinned to the body. "This is what happens to spies and infidels." Or, "Do not touch this body until 11 a.m. or you will be next." Before long, people had a new name for the green square. They started calling it the Bloody Square. I shuddered to hear these stories. What was becoming of my city? What would become of us? "God," I said when I went to bed, "I know you are busy with many, many things around the world, but do you see what's happening here in Swat?" One night, I overheard my parents talking in hushed voices. "You must do it," my mother said. "To be afraid is no solution." "I will not go without your blessing," my father said. "God will protect you," she said, "because you are speaking the truth." I stepped out of my hiding place and asked what was going on. My father said he was going to a meeting that night to speak out against the Taliban, and after that he would travel to Islamabad to take the government to ask for not protecting its citizens. My father, a simple principal, was taking on the two most powerful and dangerous forces in the country, and my mother was standing by him. Most Pashtun women would cry and beg and cling to their husbands' sleeves, but most Pashtun men would ignore their wives. Few would have even consulted with them in the first place. But my parents were not like other parents. My father is like a falcon, the one who dared to fly where others would not go, and my mother is the one with her feet firmly planted on the ground. For my part, I took on the job of locking the house each night when my father was away. I went around the house once, twice, often 3 times, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. Sometimes my father came home quite late. Sometimes not at all. He took to sleeping at his friends' houses occasionally just in case he was being followed. He was protecting us by staying away, but he could not protect us from worrying. Those nights I heard my mother praying until all hours. One day I was traveling to Shangla with my mother and brothers. We didn't own a car, and one of our cousins was giving us a ride. As the traffic slowed to a crawl, he put a cassette to pass the time. Suddenly he ejected his tape. He scrambled to gather up the other cassettes he kept in the glove box. "Quick," he said to my mother, "hide these in your handbag." 2 men drew near our car. They were wearing black turbans and camouflage vests over their shalwar kameez. They had long hair and beards, and they were carrying Kalashnikov automatic weapons. I was face to face with the Taliban. They were searching cars for anything they claimed was forbidden by Islam. None of us said a word, but I saw my mother's hand shake as she gripped her purse where the haram items were hidden. She pulled her veil more securely across her face and lowered her gaze to her lap. The Talib leaned in the back window, his eyes bored into mine. "Sisters," he said to both of us, "you must wear a burqa. You are bringing shame." Here was a Talib with a machine gun just inches from my face. How was I bringing shame? I wanted to ask him. I was a child, a 10-year-old girl, a little girl who liked playing hide and seek and studying science. I was angry, but I knew it would do no good to try to reason with him. I knew I should have been afraid, but I only felt frustration. When we returned home from that visit to Shangla, we found a letter for my father taped to the school gate. "Sir, the school you are running is Western and infidel. It said, you teach girls, and you have a uniform that is un-Islamic. Stop this, or you will be in trouble, and your children will weep and cry for you." It was signed, Fedayeen of Islam, devotees of Islam. The Taliban had threatened my father. Now I was afraid.